We're standing in a rather obscure part of a very well-known location. And the location is the Little Stony Hill, also today known as the Loop, simply because the battlefield road loops around it. But this is where Brooks Brigade and several others are going to sweep through this terrain to do battle with Confederates of Kershaw and Semmes right up here in Rose Woods. Now, what I would like to talk to you though about is our monuments. We have many, many, many monuments. We don't even have an exact count because it depends on how you count them. There may be upwards of about 1,200 plus monuments and markers and identifying tablets on this battlefield. So you have to stop and think for a minute. The local citizens of Gettysburg come to town, or are in the town. The Confederate and Union forces come, they do battle, they go away, and the town is just bystanders. That's not true. The citizens had involvement at the front end, they had involvement during the battle, and they had a pretty significant involvement in the creation of the Gettysburg National Military Park. In fact, it was early citizens of the town that started to buy up ground in order to preserve it as a place to remember and memorialize the men who fought here. So that gave rise to veteran involvement in the late 1870s. As they came back to reunion, they would add more and more pieces of ground to their holdings. And then they started to put up markers. Now, the very first markers on the battlefield of Gettysburg were death markers. To Chapman of Connecticut, to Merwin of Connecticut, to Strong Vincent of the brigade on Little Round Top, General Zook. But then several regiments came, the survivors associations, and they began to put up monuments honoring an entire regiment. So our very first was the 2nd Massachusetts in 1879 that sits over at the base of Culp's Hill near Spangler Spring. And then that gave rise to other veterans thinking along the same lines. So when you come to Gettysburg and you see beautiful rows of organized battle lines, that is not what the initial vision of this park was. In fact, there was no vision for monumentation. It evolved. So it starts with the death markers, and then the very modest funerary monuments that gave rise to the beautiful regimental monuments that we see in battle lines today, and all the way up to the Confederate state monuments. So you see an evolution, and you see local citizens involved in that evolution of monument erections. So imagine this, you're from New England, or you're from some other state, and you want to come and put a monument up at Gettysburg. You're going to have to prepare a piece of ground, and you're going to have to lay in a foundation, and you're going to have to put in a base for that monument. That's where the locals come in. Because of this beautiful Gettysburg rock, some people call it Gettysburg granite. It's not all granite. Some of it's just diabase rock. But in any case, this local resource lent itself to a lot of the monumentation that occurred at Gettysburg. Now, we're standing in a place known as Wible's Quarry. Wible's Quarry. Mr. Wible, William Wible, was a gentleman who eventually bought up the land that was known as the Rose Farm during the battle. He even bought the wheat field and owned it for a while. But he also, he was kind of an entrepreneur, a jack of all trades, and he had a business card that he put out. And the business card actually said that he was prepared with a good team to carry passengers over the battlefield, but he also was willing to convey that he could haul monuments and put in foundations for same. So he had a regular business of quarrying rock and putting it in places where monuments were going to be placed. So we're standing at his quarry, part of his quarry anyway. It was pretty extensive, stretches across the park road today, but we're standing here near a boulder that shows you evidence of his work. Now, how does one without power tools achieve a nice squared off chunk of stone to kind of finish off and put in the ground that looks nice to put a monument on? Well, they did it by hand. It was truly an artisan's skill. So what you would do is you'd punch little holes in a line. You draw a line on a big boulder like this one, and then you would put little holes, small holes you would put in with like a nail or something like that, or a hand drill. Then you would place in those holes an interesting little piece of equipment known as a feather and wedge. So imagine a bobby pin, if you will, of sorts, two pieces of iron that look like this, and then you would put a bolt or a wedge down between the open end, and you would place that collection of steel or metal down in the holes that you have drilled. And here is evidence of them. There's still some remaining in the rock today in a line. And then you would begin to pound the wedge all up and down the rock and in a line. And eventually you would develop a crack. Then you could put a large thing like a big iron wedge, and you could stick it in there and eventually break the rock apart into nice, manageable size rocks that you could then dress or clean up, and they would become the monument foundations and bases. So you're seeing evidence here of Mr. Wible's work as he spent a great deal of time helping to put in monuments on the battlefield of Gettysburg. He probably did a lot of other things like cornerstones of local buildings and things like that. But it's of course a concern to us what he did on behalf of the veterans as they dedicated their monuments at Gettysburg. There was another man during the battle that achieved some fame. His name was Solomon Powers. We know him as having a stone cutting yard on the corner of High and Washington Street. Now, Solomon Powers was fairly old during the time of the battle. He had 5 adult daughters who all nursed during the battle. But his cutting yard was eventually acquired by a team of partnership, Pitt and Turf and Wilson. They advertised exactly the same thing in Gettysburg. They would put in monument bases, and they would put in monument foundations. They would cut stone for people, etc., according to their ad. Lowest estimates available, according to them. So you have this operation among the citizens of the county, helping the veterans to preserve for future generations what happened on these hallowed fields of Gettysburg. So just to show you a real close-up real quick of what you see here in the rock, because it might be a little hard to see, we will make sure you see close-up pictures of this. But here's just a really interesting illustration of the operation of putting in feathers and wedges on the battlefield. So here's a photograph showing, here's the feather and wedge, and here's the combination placed in the holes, and they will be pounded into place, creating the split in the rock, which will separate it into manageable chunks.